August 18th, 1945, that the air over a small Japanese coastal town hangs unnaturally still. For the first time in years, there is no siren, no distant engine noise, no warning shouted through the streets. Just silence, heavy, unfamiliar, and frightening. Wooden houses stand scarred by shock waves. Windows are patched with paper. Ash still clings to corners where firestorms once passed. Inside a school building converted into a shelter, women sit close together. Mothers, daughters, nurses, widows. They speak quietly, if at all. For weeks, rumors have moved faster than facts. They were told surrender would bring chaos, that foreign soldiers would arrive without restraint, that order would vanish the moment the war ended. Then boots sound on the road outside. Not running, not shouting, measured footsteps, even spacing. A patrol forms at the street's edge, helmets on, rifles slung, eyes scanning not for enemies, but for disorder. An American guard takes position at the intersection and does not move. No homes are entered. No voices are raised. That night, for the first time since the surrender announcement, nothing burns. Nothing breaks. And the fear that had been tightening for days pauses, confused, uncertain, wondering what this unexpected calm means. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a nation physically shattered and psychologically exhausted. For months, American B-29 bombers had crossed the skies almost nightly. Cities burned not as isolated targets, but as entire systems. Homes, workshops, schools, and markets collapsing together. Tokyo in March. Osaka in June. Dozens of regional cities followed. By August, more than 60 urban areas had been heavily damaged or destroyed. Transportation was fractured. Food distribution barely functioned. Millions were displaced. Civilian life, especially for women, had narrowed to survival. Women staffed hospitals stripped of medicine. They worked in factories that were later reduced to rubble. They organized evacuation centers, cared for children separated from parents, and buried the dead with little ceremony because there was no time. Many men were absent, killed, missing, or still stationed far from home. Authority at the local level had thinned to a few exhausted officials and neighborhood associations struggling to keep order. Then came August 6th and August 9th. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. News traveled slowly, incompletely, but its effect was immediate. Rumors filled the gaps where information could not. Entire cities erased. A single weapon. No defense. No warning. When Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement was broadcast on August 15th, many civilians heard his voice for the first time and did not fully understand his words. The language was formal, indirect. But one thing was clear. The war was over. What followed was not relief. It was fear. Years of wartime propaganda had painted Allied soldiers, particularly Americans, as brutal, undisciplined, and vengeful. Civilians were told capture meant humiliation or worse. Women were warned to expect violence once enemy troops arrived. Some local officials quietly advised families to hide daughters or prepare for the worst. In several areas, misinformation spread faster than official guidance. At the same time, Japan's internal control mechanisms were weakening. Police forces were understaffed. Military units were disbanding or awaiting orders. Black markets expanded overnight as ration systems collapsed. Refugees crowded into undamaged towns. In this vacuum, civilians feared not only foreign soldiers, but looting, revenge attacks, and a breakdown of social restraint. For Japanese women, the danger felt immediate and personal. Many had lived under strict codes of conduct throughout the war. Now those rules seemed suddenly irrelevant. The authority that enforced them had surrendered. The future was undefined. Nights were the hardest. Darkness brought uncertainty, and uncertainty invited panic. Yet the American occupation had not begun impulsively. Even before the surrender, U.S. planners anticipated exactly this moment. They studied Japan's social structure, civilian psychology, and the consequences of sudden defeat. Reports warned that uncontrolled entry could trigger mass disorder. Not because civilians were hostile, but because they were terrified. The coming days would test whether victory would arrive as chaos or as control. And that question would be answered not in speeches or treaties, but on quiet streets, guarded intersections, and the behavior of individual soldiers standing watch. The American arrival in Japan was not improvised. It was one of the most carefully planned military occupations in modern history. Long before the surrender, Allied planners understood that defeating Japan militarily would be only half the challenge. What followed mattered just as much. A chaotic occupation risked humanitarian disaster, resistance, or civil collapse. Discipline, restraint, and control were therefore written directly into operational doctrine. Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, General Douglas MacArthur, assumed authority over the occupation in August 1945. Under his command, strict behavioral codes were issued to every American unit scheduled to land in Japan. Soldiers were reminded that they were not entering enemy territory in battle, but a defeated nation in transition. The mission was stability. Military police units were prioritized. Guard rotations were mapped in advance. Curfews were established almost immediately upon arrival. Key infrastructure, bridges, water stations, hospitals, food depots, was secured not to dominate civilians, but to prevent collapse. In many towns, guards were posted before large numbers of troops were visible. Orders emphasized self-control. Looting was forbidden. Violence against civilians was punishable by court-martial. Unauthorized entry into homes was prohibited. Interaction with civilians, especially women, was to be formal and minimal. These are not suggestions. They were enforced. American commanders understood Japanese fears, even if Japanese civilians did not yet understand American intentions. Psychological assessments prepared for occupation forces warned that women and children were the most vulnerable to panic. Visible discipline was therefore essential. A guard standing still, enforcing order quietly, was often more effective than an entire platoon moving aggressively. This approach contrasted sharply with what many Japanese expected. Years of total war had erased trust. Civilians assumed defeat meant exposure. Rumors of retribution circulated freely. In some areas, local leaders feared internal unrest more than foreign troops. Desperate civilians stealing food, settling grievances, or fleeing in uncontrolled masses. The first occupation landings reflected this planning. Advance parties entered ports and airfields under controlled conditions. They did not fan out aggressively. They secured perimeters. They posted guards at intersections, depots, and shelters. They enforced calm by presence rather than force. For women watching from doorways and windows, this was disorienting. There was no shouting, no celebratory chaos, no triumphant displays. Guards stood in place for hours, sometimes entire shifts, without interaction. Their role was not to intimidate, but to stabilize. Behind this restraint lay clear, strategic reasoning. American leadership knew that a population overwhelmed by fear could become unpredictable. Calm reduced risk. Order prevented unnecessary suffering. Discipline protected both occupiers and civilians. Within days, reports began noting an unexpected outcome. Incidents of violence were fewer than anticipated. Markets reopened under supervision. Shelters remained intact. Refugees stayed put instead of fleeing blindly. Women, initially hiding indoors, began venturing out cautiously during daylight. The occupation's success was not measured by conquest, but by the absence of chaos. And within that controlled environment, the experiences of Japanese women would become one of the clearest indicators of whether discipline could overcome fear. The human angle. For Japanese women, the occupation was not an abstract policy. It was lived minute by minute. In the days immediately after surrender, many remained indoors. Doors were barred not against bombs, but against uncertainty. Mothers kept children close. Nurses slept in shifts. Widows avoided public spaces altogether. Fear had been conditioned over years, reinforced by warnings that defeat would bring lawlessness. When American guards appeared, the reaction was cautious, not relieved. The shock came gradually. Guards did not stare. They did not approach unnecessarily. They stood at fixed points, near water pumps, intersections, shelter entrances, and stayed there. Their stillness contradicted expectation. Women watching from distance began to notice patterns. Patrols at the same times, guards relieved methodically, no deviation in behavior. This predictability mattered. Predictability meant safety. Within days, women began using guarded areas as places of refuge rather than threat. Shelters under military supervision remained orderly. Food distribution points were protected from theft. Nighttime violence, feared more than anything, did not materialize at scale. For many, the realization was unsettling. The feared moment had passed without disaster. The military discipline angle. American soldiers were not acting on instinct. They were executing doctrine. Occupation troops were trained to suppress emotion, not display victory. They were instructed to avoid confrontation and maintain posture. Guard duty was emphasized over patrol aggression. The purpose was not to demonstrate power, but to deny disorder the space to grow. Military police played a central role. They enforced curfews with consistency. They intervened quickly in disputes, not with force, but authority. Visible restraint became a signal to civilians that chaos would not be tolerated. This discipline also protected the soldiers themselves. Commanders understood that uncontrolled interaction could spiral into incidents that undermined the entire occupation. Order was self-preservation as much as humanitarian policy. The psychological angle. Fear does not disappear when danger ends. It lingers, waiting for confirmation. For Japanese women, confirmation came not through words, but absence. Absence of violence, absence of looting, absence of retaliation. Each quiet night weakened the power of rumor. Each guarded intersection replaced imagination with reality. Psychologists later noted that fear conditioned by propaganda collapses fastest when expectations are unmet. The occupation's restraint created cognitive dissonance. The enemy did not behave as predicted. This forced reassessment. Women began adjusting routines. Children were allowed outside. Nurses resumed structured care. Civilian networks slowly reformed under the assumption that order would hold. This was not gratitude. It was stabilization. And stabilization was the occupation's first victory. Not over territory, but over panic. Yet these angles tell only part of the story. Leadership decisions and moral calculations shaped everything that followed. The leadership angle. At the center of the occupation stood a command structure acutely aware of historical precedent. Failed occupations, marked by humiliation, reprisals, or unchecked troops, had repeatedly produced resistance rather than submission. American leadership in Japan sought the opposite outcome. General MacArthur's headquarters issued clear priorities: preserve public order, prevent civilian suffering, and avoid actions that could be interpreted as vengeance. These principles filtered downward through every level of command. Officers were held personally responsible for the conduct of their men. Discipline was not optional. It was the measure of success. Guard assignments reflected this philosophy. The most visible soldiers were often those with the strictest orders and the least freedom of action. Stillness became a leadership tool. A soldier who did nothing, but did it perfectly, sent a message stronger than any show of force. For Japanese women observing from a distance, leadership was invisible, but its effects were unmistakable. The moral contrast angle. The moral weight of restraint carried significance precisely because it contradicted wartime expectations. For years, total war had erased distinctions between combatant and civilian. Bombing campaigns had blurred moral lines. Fear had become normalized. In this context, restraint felt almost unnatural. American guards did not claim moral authority openly. They demonstrated it indirectly, by enforcing rules evenly, by preventing disorder without humiliation, and by maintaining control without cruelty. Women expecting chaos instead encountered boundaries. This contrast forced a re-evaluation of assumptions. The enemy did not arrive as an unrestrained force. Instead, they imposed limits on themselves and on the environment. The enemy perspective angle. From the Japanese side, Shock did not mean admiration. It meant confusion. Military and civilian reports from late 1945 note repeated references to surprise at American behavior. Civilians had prepared for breakdown, not structure. Some local officials feared that calm was temporary, a prelude to harsher measures. Women, often excluded from formal political interpretation, judged by experience. If nights remained quiet, if shelters remained safe, if guards remained consistent, then the immediate threat receded. This recalibration of fear marked a psychological turning point. The occupation had not yet reshaped Japan, but it had interrupted panic. And that interruption set the stage for the moment when order would be visibly, undeniably established. The turning point did not come with a single announcement or a dramatic confrontation. It arrived quietly, over several nights when nothing happened. In the final days of August 1945, American occupation forces expanded their presence beyond ports and airfields into residential districts. This was the moment many civilians feared most. Rumors had warned that the first deep entry into neighborhoods would bring disorder. Women prepared accordingly, moving valuables, restricting movement, staying awake long into the night. Instead, they encountered a pattern. Guards were posted before dusk. Patrols followed the same routes at the same hours. Curfews were enforced without shouting. When disputes arose, over food lines, shelter space, or movement, they were resolved quickly and without spectacle. The absence of escalation became noticeable. In several towns, local Japanese police were instructed to continue their duties under supervision. This continuity mattered. It preserved familiar authority while reinforcing new limits. For women navigating public spaces, this layered structure reduced fear. The environment felt controlled rather than occupied. Night after night, fires did not spread. Shelters were not overrun. Violence did not surge. The expected collapse failed to materialize. For Japanese women, this failure of chaos marked a psychological shift. Fear began to loosen its grip, not replaced by trust, but by calculation. If the guards remained, if order held, then survival strategies could change. Movement increased during daylight hours. Communication resumed between neighborhoods. Informal support networks reactivated. American forces reinforced this stability deliberately. Guard positions remained unchanged. Discipline did not relax with familiarity. Soldiers were rotated to prevent exhaustion and misconduct. Infractions were punished visibly within the military, signaling that restraint was not temporary. The occupation's decisive moment was therefore not an act of force, but endurance. Order persisted long enough to become credible. Women who had watched silently from behind doors now passed guarded intersections openly. They noted which areas were safest. Shelters near guard posts filled first. Mothers adjusted routines based on patrol schedules. This was not submission. It was adaptation. And adaptation meant the occupation had crossed its most fragile threshold. The moment when fear either explodes or dissipates. By early September, reports from multiple regions noted a decline in civilian panic incidents. The American presence had become predictable. Predictability replaced rumor. Yet one final test remained. Whether this calm would hold as occupation forces expanded further, and whether discipline would endure under strain. By the first week of September 1945, the occupation reached its most sensitive phase. American units began assuming responsibility for entire urban districts and surrounding rural areas. This expansion increased contact with civilians and multiplied the risk of incident. If discipline failed now, earlier calm would collapse. It did not. Guard structures held. Curfews remained consistent. Military police responded to violations swiftly and uniformly. Soldiers were reminded daily that their conduct shaped the mission's success. Fatigue was managed through rotations. Alcohol restrictions were enforced. Commanders inspected posts personally. For Japanese women, the effect was cumulative. Markets reopened under supervision. Women stood in lines without fear of looting. Hospitals operated without interference. Shelters no longer prepared for flight at night. The environment stabilized not because danger vanished, but because it was controlled. One of the most significant moments came when American guards intervened to stop civilian-on-civilian violence. Disputes over food or housing, inevitable after defeat, were contained before escalation. This action sent a clear signal. Chaos would not be tolerated from any source. This was the moment when fear of both the occupier and one's own surroundings began to recede. The occupation's authority became visible not through dominance, but through prevention. Violence did not need to be punished if it never began. Disorder did not need to be crushed if it was denied space. Japanese women, who had expected abandonment after surrender, instead found themselves protected by rules they did not write, but could rely on. Guarded intersections became neutral zones. Patrol schedules became reference points for safety. By mid-September, civilian movement patterns reflected this shift. Women traveled farther from shelters. Children attended informal schools. Neighborhoods reorganized under the assumption of continuity. The shock embedded in these changes was quiet but profound. The enemy had not arrived to exploit vulnerability. They had arrived to enforce stability. This realization marked the true turning point of the occupation. Fear no longer dictated behavior. Expectation did. And expectation, once altered, reshaped societies faster than force ever could. By the first week of September 1945, the occupation reached its most sensitive phase. American units began assuming responsibility for entire urban districts and surrounding rural areas. This expansion increased contact with civilians and multiplied the risk of incident. If discipline failed now, earlier calm would collapse. It did not. Guard structures held. Curfews remained consistent. Military police responded to violations swiftly and uniformly. Soldiers were reminded daily that their conduct shaped the mission's success. Fatigue was managed through rotations. Alcohol restrictions were enforced. Commanders inspected posts personally. For Japanese women, the effect was cumulative. Markets reopened under supervision. Women stood in lines without fear of looting. Hospitals operated without interference. Shelters no longer prepared for flight at night. The environment stabilized not because danger vanished, but because it was controlled. One of the most significant moments came when American guards intervened to stop civilian-on-civilian violence. Disputes over food or housing, inevitable after defeat, were contained before escalation. This action sent a clear signal. Chaos would not be tolerated from any source. This was the moment when fear of both the occupier and one's own surroundings began to recede. The occupation's authority became visible not through dominance, but through prevention. Violence did not need to be punished if it never began. Disorder did not need to be crushed if it was denied space. Japanese women, who had expected abandonment after surrender, instead found themselves protected by rules they did not write, but could rely on. Guarded intersections became neutral zones. Patrol schedules became reference points for safety. By mid-September, civilian movement patterns reflected this shift. Women traveled farther from shelters. Children attended informal schools. Neighborhoods reorganized under the assumption of continuity. The shock embedded in these changes was quiet but profound. The enemy had not arrived to exploit vulnerability. They had arrived to enforce stability. This realization marked the true turning point of the occupation. Fear no longer dictated behavior. Expectation did. And expectation, once altered, reshaped societies faster than force ever could. The first weeks of occupation demonstrated that disciplined control could prevent large-scale disorder, even in a nation unaccustomed to defeat. Reports from U.S. military intelligence noted a sharp decline in incidents of theft, assault, and panic compared with initial projections. Cities like Yokohama, Sendai, and Fukuoka recorded fewer than expected disturbances despite dense concentrations of displaced civilians. Hospitals, schools, and shelters remained operational under supervision, confirming the effectiveness of guard rotations and curfews. For Japanese women, The aftermath was tangible in daily routines. Mothers allowed children to leave shelters under watchful eyes. Nurses resumed work in medical facilities. Widows and elderly women walked to markets for supplies without fear of harassment. Neighborhood networks, once fragmented by evacuation and bombing, began to function again. The presence of guards created predictable spaces, intersections, squares, and water stations that became points of safety and coordination. The psychological impact was equally important. For months, civilians had been conditioned to expect brutality. The absence of it challenged assumptions deeply ingrained by propaganda and rumor. Women observed patterns. Soldiers did not enter homes without permission. Disputes were resolved without violence. And curfews were enforced with consistency rather than arbitrary force. Slowly, the expectation of survival without exploitation reshaped behavior. American reports highlighted another effect. The reduction of civil unrest minimized the risk to occupation forces. Patrols remained orderly. Incidents of confrontation with civilians were rare, and troops could focus on rebuilding and logistical support rather than crisis management. The strict adherence to discipline proved that restraint, combined with visibility, could substitute for direct control through force. The first phase of aftermath, therefore, was stabilization. Streets no longer carried the tension of fear. Shelters remained secure. Food distribution and medical aid continued without disruption. The American occupation had transformed an anticipated environment of chaos into one governed by order. This calm, however, was only the initial stage. The broader implications of sustained discipline on civilian trust, governance, and the psychological adaptation to occupation would emerge more fully as the American presence expanded. As the occupation progressed through September and into October 1945, the consequences of the disciplined American presence became increasingly evident. Japanese women, once confined by fear, began navigating public spaces with cautious confidence. Markets operated under supervision, enabling access to scarce food and resources. Water distribution points, guarded by American personnel, became hubs of civilian coordination. Public facilities, schools, hospitals, and shelters functioned with renewed consistency. Even simple activities, like sending children to school or visiting neighbors, reflected a society beginning to trust a predictable order. Military reports emphasized that the presence of guards had a stabilizing effect beyond immediate safety. Civilian disputes were contained quickly. Theft, assault, and harassment remained at historically low levels for a post-surrender period. These outcomes confirmed the efficacy of training and planning. Visible discipline, repeated routines, and enforceable rules could replace chaos with structure. The psychological impact on women was profound. Initially, fear dominated every action, fueled by years of propaganda and wartime trauma. Yet, the controlled environment provided by American guards disrupted those expectations. Women began to understand that the occupiers' behavior was consistent, lawful, and predictable. Slowly, survival strategies evolved from hiding and avoidance to measured engagement with public life. This recalibration shaped social routines for months to come. In parallel, Japanese officials, both civilian and former military, adjusted to the occupation's reality. The consistent enforcement of rules allowed limited governance to persist. Local leaders could operate within a framework of order rather than chaos. The credibility of American authority, established through visible restraint, reduced the likelihood of resistance or panic-driven uprisings. The aftermath also influenced broader societal perceptions. Reports from U.S. intelligence highlighted women expressing astonishment at the restraint shown by occupation forces. Letters and diaries recorded a repeated theme: "We expected violence. Instead, we found order." This sentiment, observed across multiple prefectures, reflected a dramatic shift in trust toward the occupying authority. Ultimately, the occupation's success in these early months demonstrated a principle that would inform post-war policy. Authority exercised through discipline and predictability could achieve compliance without coercion. For Japanese women, this approach offered both safety and an unexpected measure of dignity in a world they had feared would descend into disorder. The experience of Japanese women during the early American occupation offers a quiet but powerful lesson in the nature of authority and human expectation. When defeat arrives, fear often dictates behavior. Anticipation of violence can be more dangerous than violence itself. In Japan, women had lived under years of propaganda, evacuation, and bombardment, preparing for disorder that, in the absence of planning, might have engulfed entire communities. Yet the discipline of American guards disrupted this cycle. Calm replaced panic. Predictability replaced rumor. Restraint became a form of power more effective than aggression. This moment is significant for several reasons. Historically, it demonstrates that victory does not end with weapons alone. It ends with the establishment of order, the management of expectation, and the careful calibration of human behavior. Military planning, when combined with empathy and discipline, can stabilize societies in the aftermath of conflict. The U.S. occupation of Japan exemplified this principle. Authority was exercised without excess, and control was maintained without cruelty. For the women who lived through it, the occupation reshaped daily life. Their routines returned slowly, under the watchful but restrained presence of soldiers who had not been sent to punish, but to stabilize. The shock they initially felt, seeing the enemy act with discipline rather than brutality, highlighted the gap between expectation and reality. That gap, bridged through structure control, became the foundation for social recovery. Finally, this episode underscores a broader human truth. Fear can be as binding as chains, and restraint can be as protective as walls. History often records battles in terms of strategy and casualty, but the quieter triumphs, moments when order preserves life and dignity, define the texture of societies emerging from war. The streets once feared, the intersections once avoided, and the shelters once crowded with uncertainty became places of survival, learning, and cautious hope. In those spaces, Japanese women witnessed not just an occupation, but the disciplined humanity of a power choosing order over chaos, a legacy that shaped the trajectory of post-war Japan for generations to come.